Newcastle upon Tyne is an incredible city, with its vibrant nightlife, beautiful buildings, and of course its fascinating history.
It is the latter of which I will be discussing in today's video, but more specifically, a brief look into the long and fascinating history of Newcastle's Grand Cathedral.
The cathedral finds its beginnings in the early medieval period as a parish church around the latter of the 11th century AD, when, according to a medieval book from the cathedral itself, the site saw the erection of a timber church called St. Nicholas's.
St. Nicholas's Church was originally thought to have been founded by King Henry I. However, with thanks to an earlier medieval account, it turns out it's actually a lot older. In fact, it was founded far earlier in 1091 AD by the King William Rufus. The church got its name, St. Nicholas, from the patron saint of sailors and boats, presumably due to its close proximity to the River Tyne. Many medieval accounts claim that the church was burnt down on multiple occasions, with the last being at the end of the 13th century. So, because of this continuing issue, in 1275 AD, the decision was made to completely rebuild the church bigger and better than ever in stone.
Now, back then, churches and cathedrals didn't take that long to build, with hundreds of skilled craftsmen working on their construction 24/7. But St. Nicholas's seemed to break that tradition, as it took over a century to be finally completed in 1359. Not long after the stone church was completed, philanthropists Robert and Alice Rhodes funded the construction of both the lantern spire and the font in 1448.
The lantern spire of St. Nicholas's Cathedral is an absolute masterpiece of architecture and medieval engineering. Standing at 194 feet high, this magnificent spire towers over the Newcastle landscape still to this day. In fact, not only is it architecturally stunning, but the artwork upon it too is just absolutely out of this world, as it beautifully depicts different religious figures on each corner of the lantern spire. From here, we now shift onto what's called the early modern period, which, much like the medieval period, had a lot going on.
Since the 1200s, the church had been part of the Diocese of Durham, which essentially means that it was overseen and looked after by the Bishop of Durham. However, in 1553, the town of Newcastle attempted to raise its status from town to city, and in doing so, separate itself from the Diocese of Durham. It wasn't long until these efforts were brought to a dead end, as Queen Mary Tudor halted their attempts upon her accession to the throne.
Unfortunately for the town of Newcastle, and by proxy, the Church of St. Nicholas, things only got worse from here.
Just less than 100 years later, Newcastle fell under a 9-week siege by Scottish invaders during the civil war between the Roundheads, who wanted rid of the monarchy, and Royalists who, as their name suggests, wanted the monarchy to stay.
This 9-week siege completely devastated the town of Newcastle, including St. Nicholas's Church, which saw pretty much all of its stained glass windows from the medieval period completely destroyed. However, thankfully, not all hope's lost, because one medieval window managed to survive.
Found in St. Margaret's Chapel, this spectacular stained glass art is the only known surviving medieval window which depicts Madonna feeding the child Jesus Christ.
The Scottish didn't stop there, as their next move was to threaten the destruction of the lantern spire. However, the mayor of Newcastle at the time was having none of it. In fact, he came up with a cunning plan that would ensure the spire stayed intact.
Newcastle's mayor during this terrible siege, Sir John Marley, cleverly decided to imprison Scottish prisoners of war in the lantern spire itself. It was a brilliant plan, and meant that there was absolutely no way the Scottish would destroy it if there were their own people trapped up there. And, as you might guess, it worked a treat. By the Victorian age, the tower of the church was falling into disrepair, especially in 1865, when nearby building works caused the tower to start leaning. So, In an effort to avoid a leaning tower of Newcastle, Sir Gilbert Scott oversaw the tower's restoration.
It was during the Victorian era too that this church became something far bigger.
For hundreds of years, ever since its foundation, St Nicholas's had always been a church. But in the year 1882, its status was raised to what we now know it as, St Nicholas's Cathedral, or just Newcastle Cathedral of course. And finally, after being a part of the Diocese of Durham for so long, the cathedral shifted over to the newly formed Diocese of Newcastle.
During this time, and continuing on into the early 20th century, Newcastle became a centre of the growing Industrial Revolution, supporting coal, iron and shipbuilding industries. In reflection of this, the Chapel of St George was installed, alongside stained glass windows to commemorate the industrial boom of Newcastle.
It was also around this time, at the advent of the 20th century, that the country fell into a state of mourning. After reigning for 63 years, Queen Victoria passed away, bringing the Victorian era to an end.
In reflection of her death, and in commemoration of her reign, a stunning bronze statue was erected of her in St Nicholas's Square, just outside the cathedral, in 1903.
Not long after Queen Victoria's death, World War I devastated the world, including the lives of people in Newcastle and its surrounding areas throughout Northumbria. In response to this, the cathedral saw many memorials erected throughout the interior, including a stained glass window in the north aisle which commemorates the Northumberland Fusiliers who sadly passed away while fighting for their country.
With the end of World War I in 1918, the church bells rang full peal, which is a non-stop sequence of over 5,000 changes, with the cathedral's website claiming that this cathedral is the only cathedral in England to have ever rang full peal.
Despite being called the war to end all wars, a Second World War soon began in 1939. With this heartbreaking news, the cathedral began protecting itself, including the font as seen in these pictures. This clearly wasn't enough, however, as in 1941 the cathedral suffered damage from German air raids. Though thankfully not directly hit, the Ascension Chapel's grand window was shattered and brought into disrepair, and so was sadly boarded up.
In 1945, World War II finally came to an end. To mark this incredible moment in history, the Mayor of Newcastle stood just here, where I'm standing now, in St Nicholas's Square, to announce to the town of Newcastle that the war in Europe had finally ended.
17 years later, the window in the Ascension Chapel, which had been completely decimated in the tragic air raids of 1941, was elaborately restored with a fitting replacement which commemorates those who fought for the country during the Second World War. Which brings us to today, 82 years later. An incredibly fascinating and beautiful work of architecture which has seen almost 1,000 years of history. What do you want to see next? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll be sure to check it out in a future video. Thank you all for watching.